So for the last part of our discussion in the class, we're going to be moving into the Americas, right? So we'll be looking at South America first, Mesoamerica next, and then finally finishing up with Native American discussion. So we're going to be hanging out in the Americas. So South America, you're looking at a map here of all the various, contemporary countries that fall into South America. You'll see it's a vast place with a lot of different environments, geographies, right, weather, that's going to influence, right, the kind of art that's made. Now, when we look at historical objects, we typically tend to look at objects that are being made in the areas of Chile, Peru, sort of the West Coast region. The reason why is because to the right to the east, you're dealing with a lot of rainforest. So, like the Brazilian area, Paraguay, Uruguay, a lot of that is rainforest, and so it's very humid, very tropical, and a lot of art objects don't survive that kind of environment. So, the historical objects we look at from like the Inca, for instance, or the Nazca, those groups are living in more arid, dry regions, more mountainous regions on the west coast. So when you look at historic objects, you'll notice that we tend to stick or hug the west coast along the Pacific Ocean. Of course, when we talk about contemporary art, we're going to be looking at art from all over, right, South America. So just something to keep in mind about geography. Another thing I also try to point out is some of the identifiers, as I'd put it, or labels we would use when speaking about this region and really the whole of the Americas, right? You'll hear these type of labels such as pre and post Columbian or Latin American. And I think it's important to understand what these labels refer to or what do these labels identify. When we say pre-Columbian, we're talking about before the arrival of Columbus. So you'll often hear these objects talked about as pre-Columbian or post-Columbian. Pre-Columbian you hear a lot more frequently used, of course, than post-Columbian, but you get the point. You're talking about objects that are before or after colonial impact, essentially. So when we talk about like, the Nazca or the Inca, later when we talk about like the Maya, we're talking about pre-Columbian cultures. Then you also have the term Latin America. This comes from the type of languages that were brought to this region through colonization, what we typically call Romance languages, that come from the Latin, which comes from Rome, hence Romance. So you're looking at like Spanish, Portuguese, etc. We refer to this area as Latin America because, again, it's an area where predominantly Romance languages are now spoken. So this is where that label comes from. And then finally, you have Latino, Latina, Latinx. You also can get into, of course, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, or Hispanic. Now, how you use these identifiers can be very specific regionally, and also in a sense can be part of a heritage of how people actually identify within themselves. One thing I've noticed with like Latino, right, is I tend to see it used more along the East Coast of the Americas when it's used. And Chicano tends to be something I see in the West in America, in the United States of America. So again, it's often quite regional in how these markers are used. Hispanic, refers more to the idea of someone who comes from Spain, and again that sort of heritage. So you can see it can get a little complicated. So I find that when I'm talking to someone from these backgrounds, I often let them tell me how they identify because it's for them to say, not for me to say. Like so when I'm thinking about artists, I often look into the literature of like, well, oh, they identify as Chicano. Okay, that makes sense. I'll use that. That's what they are saying they identify as. I also want to bring up the use of the X. In recent years, of course, we've seen a lot of conversation about gender, the idea of trans and different types of, I guess, rejection of the label of gender in a lot of ways. And so I think this came about, the use of the X came about because Romance languages are gendered languages. Words are literally masculine or feminine. So when you learn Spanish, you learn that, words have gender and that changes how you'd conjugate the word or how you use the indefinite article in front of them, right? whether it's an L or a la, for instance, before the word. So obviously, to have a language that has gender, and then to try to talk about, well, what is gender anyway? And does gender really exist? Is gender a label? So on and so forth. You'll notice it gets, once again, kind of complicated. So we find that many in the community have turned to saying Latinx, or Chicanx. So they won't use the A or the O, in a sense, to try to redefine the gendering of language, let's say, and the gendering of their own identities within this community. So, but again, I've also read literature where people reject this because they say, well, it's a gendered language. There's not much we can do about it. You're going to confuse the hell out of people because, yeah, a cat has a gender, and, like a notebook has a gender. Everything has a gender. Why? We don't know originally why this happened, but, I don't know. I'm not a linguist for my background, but so again, it's something to consider as you think about labels. Now, the main points I'm going to talk to you about in our historic discussion are the idea of animal and zoomorphic imagery, burials, and then I'll have a section on the great cities as relates to Incan culture. I was lucky enough to travel to Peru now about, like 14 years ago, but when I was there, I really spent a lot of time, doing research for the class. I was on vacation, yes, but I love to go see cultural heritage as part of my trips. So I got to go see a lot of the Incan cities that I'll be talking about in the lectures with you. And, we'll start out first looking at zoomorphism. And this is a conversation that you can also use when we talk about Mesoamerican art and also Native American art. They are also going to be big users of zoomorphic imagery. Now, what is zoomorphic imagery? It is animal-related imagery. It takes the idea of animals and either presents them fairly naturalistically or, in a sense, morphs them in different types of ways. You can also see a combination of like human and animal imagery sometimes in zoomorphs as well. So again, it's something that they use. And a lot of these cultures, these American cultures, will have power animals, and they'll use power animals in various ways. So obviously zoomorphs will hold some sway in this culture for that reason. Here in South America, I'm starting us off looking at zoomorphs by looking at the Raimondi stele. Now, a couple words on vocabulary here. First off, a stele. You're going to see a lot of steles or steles. Depends on who you talk to, how they will pronounce it. I have always pronounced it stele, but again, you can also hear the pronunciation of stele, so it's really, I guess, a personal choice. The stele is a shape that's very iconic in art history. You see it in Mesoamerican art and Egyptian art and, Mesopotamian art. You see it all over the place. So we'll see it more, right, as we go on through the course. And again, it occurs in other cultures as well. Basically what it is a standing vertical monument. So, if you look behind me in this photo, it's a standing vertical monument. Basically, it's usually made out of stone and it's placed upright for display. I often laughingly call them the billboards of their time because they were probably advertising information to somebody. So that's what a stele is. So again, I'm in the National Archaeological Museum and Art Museum in Peru, right, and in Lima, the capital. And this is probably one of the most famous steles that exists there. It's one of the oldest too. And the name, you might go, well, Raimondi, that doesn't sound very Latin. Well, it's not. It's Italian, and it's named after the archaeologist that found it. So it's not really a heritage name, it's a discoverer's name, right, of the object. Now, the stele itself is hard to look at because, originally we think these were supposed to be painted. So when you're looking at a photograph of a stone stele that's lost its paint over the years, obviously it's going to be hard to interpret the imagery. So what I did was give you a nice little reconstruction drawing here to show you what the imagery did look like. And keep this in mind that a lot of older art, was very typical for the art to be painted. Go and look at like Greek culture, for instance. That stuff wasn't pure bone white like you see it, It was meant to be painted because it was meant to be very flamboyant and beautiful for the eye to look at. If you look at the imagery here, you'll notice it's zoomorphic in character, where you have this creature who's standing and appears to be holding in its hands two different staffs. So sometimes he's called the staff god because he seems to be holding these staffs in his hands. Sometimes people call him the staff god. And he's standing upright on two legs like a human would, but notice you look at the bodily characteristics and you see these claws and these fangs and different things, where obviously it's not a person. So again, it's almost combining these human and animalistic characteristics in one creature, let's say. We don't know what this thing was. Again, this is from one of the earliest cultures that existed in Peru, the Chavan de Huantar. We don't know a lot about them. They didn't have a writing system or any way for us to reference them, really. So we just look at their objects. That's all we really have. So we don't really know what this creature was. Was he a god? Was he, something else? We don't know. But what I think is interesting is that, if you look at the kind of feel of the piece, it references some stuff that we've kind of seen before, like multiplicity. We talked about that a bit in Indian culture, this idea of multiplicity or things repeating, right? You see that a bit here as well. So I think there's some overlap or similarities you can see when you look at like cultures we've already studied and looking at cultures here. Another thing I want to mention is if you look at the face, right, you'll notice that the face almost looks like it has like these fangs. And one of the things we see in American cultures is they'll often have like a fanged mouth as a theme of like how you enter the underworld. You'll see it actually on natural caves in the Americas where it'll look like a fanged mouth is carved over the cave, in the sense almost like this idea that it's an entry point, right, to the underworld or entry point to something else. Later we're going to talk in more depth about Machu Picchu when we talk about the Incan cities, but I wanted to show you that sometimes zoomorphs don't have to be sort of human and animals, right? You can just see it as pure animal imagery like you see here with the condor at Machu Picchu. And I brought up the idea of power animals. And for South Americans, they revered condors, serpents, and jaguars. Notice like the idea of a bird, a snake, right, and a cat. I actually have a little carving from Peru that has the three animals sort of all standing on each other's backs. So again, it's something that is part of their sacred sort of imagery and referencing. And we'll later see reverence for certain animals in Mesoamerican culture and Native American culture also. So this is something that the American culture seemed to focus on, is that certain animals have almost mystical qualities, reverential qualities, right, within their culture. Probably the most famous zoomorphs and animal images that you can see are what we call the Nazca lines. And the Nazca line are related to the Nazca tribe and are located, you'll notice again, hugging sort of the Pacific coast in Peru. This is a very dry region, very arid, so it's a good place to create these drawings. And we do call them drawings. They're basically made with stones placed in the environment and done on a giant scale. Basically they're out on this desert plain and just are these miles long drawings. Here you're seeing a reference to some of the drawings that are out on the plain, and you'll notice that there are many zoomorphs and many different animal images that you can see, and then also just like shapes and different types of patterns and such. These are best seen, of course, from the air. So this leads to various theories about like, well, who was intended as the audience for these? Were these made for the gods to be seen from the sky, or like, were they made to be seen from like a balloon, like somebody looking down on them? So there's a whole like line of theory about that, the ancient Nazca knew how to make hot air balloons. Take it for what it's worth. But when I look at some of the drawings, I'm again seeing certain types of animals repeated, like the condor, so you see certain animals that they revere once more. You also see like the whale, we're right there by the ocean. And then things like flowers and lizards and spiders. Now you'll notice that the way that some of these are positioned, some people have actually suggested that like the positioning of some of the drawings actually are like directional markers For like the spider, for instance, people have looked at the shape of the spider and have sort of noted that it seems to reference a spider that you'd find in the Amazon rainforest. So they look at the way that the spider was positioned and they seems to like almost point you towards like the Amazon if you were going to go take off on a little road trip, right? It's like go that way. So there's different theories about like what we think these things are meant to reference, right? Whether they're meant to be like roadmaps or, drawings for the gods. Some people think that they reference like water sources and where water sources could be located. But at the end of the day, they're very mysterious. Like we don't really know what they are. Here's some shots like, up from a plane, looking down and seeing them. And again, these were made on the desert surface with the piling up of rocks across the landscape to make these massive, massive, you know, petroglyphs, basically, they're basically rock carving, rock drawings. So they just pile them up, right? And then create these giant, sort of pictures in the landscape. So again, this is one of the most mysterious and strange kind of zoomorph animal images that we see out there. And there's a lot of these like crisscrossing lines. And so some people are like, were they building runways for their hot air balloons or, that kind of thing. And again, these are sort of the sort of side theories I always say are kind of like those history mystery kind of things, right? Like, who knows where they're really doing these kind of things. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about burials.